October 1941, Libyan Desert, North Africa. 04 to 30 a.m. Altitude, ground level. The desert night was a vast, cold silence, broken only by the rasp of sand against metal and the heavy breathing of men. In the half-light, amidst the silhouettes of British cruisers and infantry carriers, a new machine rolled out. Its profile was high, its construction boxy, its silhouette almost clumsy. This was the American contribution to the armor fight, the M3 light tank, soon to be nicknamed the Stuart. At first glance, it was an object of historical irony, a contradiction in steel. Designed in the fervent heat of American industrial mobilization, it promised speed and mass production, but its armor, a maximum of 44 millimeters on the turret, thinning drastically to as little as 12. 7 millimeters and even 9 millimeters in non-critical areas was viewed with immediate skepticism by the seasoned veterans of the British 8th Army. They had faced the lethal precision of the German 75mm anti-tank guns and the robust defense of the Panzer III. A tank this light, this fast, seemed utterly disposable. What the engineers in Detroit understood, but the men on the ground had yet to grasp, was the strategic calculus behind the Stuart. It wasn't built to duel with panzers. It was built to survive the battlefield and maintain operational readiness. Archival quote, Brigadier General Alistair Smedley, British Armour Corps. We called it the honey wire, not for sweetness, but for how the engine purred and how smooth it drove. But that smooth ride was little comfort when you saw the thickness of the steel. We felt like we were going to a gunfight in a tin can. The initial impression from the opposing side was even more scathing. When intelligence reports first detailed the Stuart specifications, the Africa Corps commanders dismissed it as a minor threat, a mere scouting vehicle. Its primary armament, the 37mm M5 cannon, while a good anti-tank gun for the mid-1930s, was already obsolete against the frontal armor of the latest German tanks. The Stuart's high profile made it an easy target. The very characteristics that made it appealing to US mass production, simplicity and speed, were seen as fatal flaws in the North African proving grounds. This initial perception of weakness is the very historical irony we must explore. The Stuart was about to demonstrate a lethal advantage that had nothing to do with armor thickness and everything to do with tactical superiority and, crucially, reliability. American industrial might meant that Stuarts could be delivered in volume, flooding the theater. It was the first time many Allied units had access to an internal combustion engine, the Continental W670, that was not only powerful, delivering 250 horsepower for a top speed of 36 mph, but also incredibly robust and easy to maintain in the brutal desert conditions. The Germans and Italians often struggled with overheating, sand filtration, and parts shortage. The Stuart, for all its visible flaws, was a mechanical mule that kept running. The true secret of the Stuart was its hidden technological package. It was one of the first tanks to standardize gyro stabilization for its main gun, allowing the crew to fire with remarkable accuracy while moving, a feat the early panzers found difficult. This was a tactical revolution in the dynamic, fluid battles of the desert. The 37mm round might not penetrate a panzer's frontal glacis, but a well-aimed shot to the tracks, or a precise burst from the 5 mounted 30-caliber Browning machine guns could cripple infantry support and secondary vehicles. The stage is set. A tank built quickly, dismissed widely, is about to enter the furnace of war. The Allied tankers drove their honey with dread, unaware that their machine held the key to transforming the tactical mobility of the desert campaign. The Germans laughed, and in war, laughter often turns quickly into terror. This is the story of how an unappreciated marvel of engineering, a tank deemed too thin-skinned to matter, became the harbinger of a strategic shift, the opening salvo of America's industrial dominance on the battlefields of Europe. But to understand the transformation, we must first dive into the initial, brutal baptism of fire. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Wabututu history. If you appreciate the detail and drama of these stories, please consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell. It helps us bring more untold histories to light. November 1941. Operation Crusader. Egypt-Libya border. Midday. Visibility low with sand in the air. The first major deployment of the M3 Stuart was not a grand triumph. It was a confused, brutal melee known as Operation Crusader. The British objective was simple: relieve Tobruk. The reality was a grinding armor clash that proved terrifyingly close. For the Stuart crews, this was their terrifying introduction to the scale of Axis firepower. The battlefield was a swirling hell of dust and smoke, where identification of friend or foe was often impossible until the tracer rounds were flying. Archival quote, Lieutenant Erich Müller, Panzer III Commander, Afrika Korps. We saw them first near Sidi Reidzeg. They looked like oversized toy cars, so high, so thin. They were fast, yes, but when we hit them with the 50mm, the effect was immediate. They often caught fire. We focused on the Crusader tanks. The M3s were easy to ignore, a nuisance. The German perception was rooted in a fatal tactical miscalculation, judging a tank by its single biggest weakness, armor thickness, rather than its total operational profile. When German and Italian mechanics first had the chance to examine captured Stuarts, the shock was not their strength, but their perceived fragility. The 9mm armor, which barely resisted heavy rifle fire in some spots, was a point of derision. Why field a tank that could be penetrated by a heavy machine gun? This focus on armor blinded the Axis to the Stuarts' true operational strength: mission endurance. While the Stuarts were indeed vulnerable, their high operational tempo delivered an overwhelming strategic advantage. They were used extensively for flanking, reconnaissance in force, and, crucially, exploiting breakthroughs. A Panzer III or IV, powerful as it was, required more complex maintenance, better quality fuel, and more frequent stops. The Stuart, with its uncomplicated radial aircraft engine, could cover more ground, spend less time in the workshop, and return to the fight faster. The strategic effect was quantitative, not qualitative. The Stuart might lose a one-on-one duel, but the sheer volume of Allied light armor overwhelmed the numerically inferior Afrika Korps. At the start of Crusader, the British had close to 700 tanks, with the Stuarts making up a significant portion of that force. The Germans fielded fewer than 400 panzers. The narrative of the war is often built around the tank-to-tank slugfest, but the Stuart story is about supporting the infantry and overwhelming the logistics chain. Archival Relato, Lieutenant James O'Connell, M3 Stuart gunner. The sound of the high-velocity round hitting us was like a giant striking a metal drum. The hull bellied out, but we could get out, fix the track, and be back on the move in an hour if the engine was good. And that engine was a beast. It kept going. We lost the battle, but we didn't lose the mobility. The element of suspense builds around the Axis's growing, reluctant realization. Initial dismissiveness turned to nagging frustration. Why were these Allied units so mobile? Why did they always seem to have fresh reconnaissance? The key was the Stuart's exceptional command layout. The tank was designed with a dedicated commander's cupola with vision ports and a superb radio system. In the chaotic, featureless desert, command and control was everything. A Stuart squadron could communicate, maneuver, and report enemy positions with an efficiency that was often lacking in the more centralized, rigid Axis formations. The speed of the Stuart was not just for movement, but for communication. It could deliver information back to headquarters faster than any other vehicle. The German commanders, focused on the tank-killing superiority of their main guns, failed to recognize that the Stuarts were not designed to kill tanks. They were designed to manage the battlefield. They spotted the enemy, drew the fire, protected the infantry's flank, and, perhaps most importantly, delivered the psychological impact of constant, overwhelming presence. This chapter closes with the first true shock for the Axis. During a counterattack near El Alamein, German reconnaissance units were ambushed by a company of Stuarts that had outflanked their position using a rarely used ridge. The gyro-stabilized 30mm guns, though weak, proved deadly accurate at short ranges against unarmored supply trucks and towed anti-tank guns. It was not a victory by firepower, but a victory by surprise and persistence. The mockery began to fade, replaced by a cold, calculating fear. The honey was showing its sting, not in the strength of its armor, but in the relentless efficiency of its design and the overwhelming numbers rolling off the American assembly lines. The tide was about to turn, not with a bang, but with the incessant roar of 1,000 reliable radial engines, early 1942, American manufacturing plant, Detroit, Michigan, interior, sound, rhythmic, deafening clang of steel. The true battleground for the M3 Stuart was not the scorched sand of North Africa, but the sprawling anonymous factories of the American Midwest. This is the scale industrial portion of our story, the moment we appreciate the sheer volume that defined the Allied victory. While soldiers sweated and fought on the front line, a relentless army of engineers and mechanics were creating the technological lifeline that saved them. The design philosophy of the Stuart was built around the principle of good enough now. It was designed to be produced quickly, in massive numbers, using existing industrial tools and a maximum of readily available components. This resulted in production figures that were mind-boggling to the Germans, whose tank production was meticulous, complex and slow. By the end of its run, over 15,000 M3, M5 Stuarts and its variants would be produced, a staggering quantity that dwarfed the combined output of all German light and medium tanks up to that point. Archival quote, Henry L. Stimson, U.S. Secretary of War. "We didn't just win the war with better guns, we won it with better manufacturing. The Stuart was ugly, but it was ready. We gave the boys on the front the numbers they needed to just keep coming." This is where the story shifts from the battle line to the design room, revealing a crucial technological element: the transition from the riveted M3 to the welded M5 Stuart. The original M3's armor was riveted, meaning high-velocity impacts could shear off rivet heads, a phenomenon morbidly called spalling, turning the inside of the tank into a metal shotgun. The improved M5 addressed this, introducing welded armor, and crucially replacing the radial engine with twin Cadillac V8 engines, hence the later M5 designation. This was an act of engineering genius, utilizing the mass-produced, highly reliable automotive engines that defined the American consumer market. The new power plant made the M5 quieter, more reliable, and even faster, while standardizing parts that could be sourced from any civilian garage. This was the ultimate expression of the war effort, the conversion of peaceful domestic production into instruments of total war. The engineers, far from the front, were heroes in their own right, constantly iterating based on battle reports. They learned from the initial vulnerability. While they couldn't drastically increase the Stuart's weight, they focused on survivability elements, improved self-sealing fuel tanks, better fire suppression systems, and improved crew ergonomics for faster reloads and faster bailout. The suspense of this chapter rests in the race against time. The Germans, with their high-quality panzers, were constantly developing better guns, like the long-barreled 7.5cm KWK 40L48 cannon. The Allies needed a flood of reliable tanks to maintain the numerical advantage until the heavier M4 Sherman could arrive in force. The Stuart was the stopgap, the vital technological bridge. The Japanese mechanics mentioned in the title are an essential piece of this puzzle, representing the ultimate validation of the Stuart's design. While the European theater focused on its thin armor, the Japanese forces, operating in jungle environments, also captured Stuarts. Historical perspective. From a translated Japanese technical report 1943, the American light tank M3-M5 is mechanically superior in reliability to our own Type 95 Hago. We observed the ease of maintenance on the engine and suspension. However, the thickness of the 9mm armor plate is an incomprehensible weakness. It would not stop our Type 99 heavy machine gun, 12 Sevimium. This suggests an over-reliance on speed rather than protection. Their conclusion was identical to the German one. The Stuart was too fragile. This shared underestimation became the strategic poison pill for the Axis. They focused resources on developing high-velocity guns to defeat the heavier Shermans, neglecting the tactical threat posed by the ubiquitous, fast-moving, and overwhelming numbers of Stuarts, which continued to provide essential flanking and infantry support. The technological triumph of the Stuart was not in its revolutionary weapon, but in its revolutionary logistics and reliability. It proved that in the vast, unforgiving expanses of the desert, the machine that keeps moving is more valuable than the machine that hits harder but spends its time broken down in the sand. This American mastery of mass production, embodied by the simple, rugged Stuart, was the moment the Axis lost the industrial war, long before they lost the battles. The Tin Can was a technological juggernaut disguised as a simple scout. Late 1942, El Alamein, Western Desert. Sound, barrage fire, distant explosions, radio chatter. The Stuart, initially feared by its crews and mocked by its enemies, had completed its transformation. No longer just a scouting vehicle, it became an integral part of the Allied combined arms strategy, and more importantly, a psychological weapon. The turning point was the Second Battle of El Alamein. This was the moment General Bernard Montgomery's forces used overwhelming armored superiority to break the Afrika Korps. The Stuarts, now comprising a key component of the armored brigade, performed their role to perfection, flanking, reconnaissance, and protecting the infantry. The drama-human element is now centered on the transformation of the crews. The tankers who once dreaded their thin armor now embraced the speed and agility of the Honey. They learned to use its small profile and high velocity to their advantage, employing a tactic known as shoot and scoot. They would rush an enemy position, fire their accurate 37mm round to suppress, and then retreat before the panzers could bring their main guns to bear. This constant harassing fire exhausted the German units. Archival Relato, Sergeant Peter Davies, M3 Stuart Commander, 7th Armored Division. The Germans hated our speed. They were built for the long shot. We were built for the rush. We'd dart out from behind the dunes, spray them with the 30 cals to blind them, and before they could traverse that heavy turret, we were gone. We weren't tank killers. We were frustration in a box. We made them burn their ammunition on dust. The Stuarts became masters of the reconnaissance by fire mission. They deliberately drew attention, using their speed to escape the resulting counterfire, thus revealing the precise location and strength of the hidden German anti-tank screens and dug-in panzers. They were sacrificial lambs with a purpose, clearing the way for the heavier M4 Shermans that were now arriving. The suspense from the German perspective was no longer about the Stuarts' armor, but its numbers and its agility. Archival quote, General Erwin Rommel, Field Marshal. The speed with which the Americans and British can replace their losses, especially of the light tanks, is demoralizing. We destroy 10 and 20 more appear the next day. This is not war. This is a factory against an army. The light tanks which we once mocked now clog the battlefield and blind our forward scouting. This quote captures the essence of the psychological shift. The mockery had turned into deep-seated terror and incredulity. The Axis was fighting an enemy that could afford to lose tanks. Every immobilized Stuart was a temporary victory for the Axis, but every Stuart that returned to base or every squadron that successfully flanked an anti-tank nest was a reminder of the relentless American industrial scale. The M5 variant, with its twin Cadillac engines, also brought a crucial advantage in the maintenance bay. The engine could be replaced by a trained crew in less than 3 hours, a staggering feat of engineering for reliability and battlefield maintenance. This contrasted sharply with the complex, time-consuming repairs required for the German vehicles, which often had to be sent miles back to a specialized workstat. The Tin Can tank was not only fast on the move, it was fast to repair. The climax of this psychological shift came in the pursuit after El Alamein. The Stuart squadrons were unleashed, their speed perfectly suited for chasing down the retreating Afrika Korps. They bypassed main roads, cut through desert tracks, and relentlessly harried the German logistical convoys. The 37mm gun, useless against a panzer's front, was lethally effective against trucks, half-tracks, and field kitchens. The Stuarts' role was finalized. It was the cavalry of the modern war. It provided eyes, speed, and fire suppression, and most importantly, it was the persistent, nagging force that never gave the enemy a moment's rest. The engineers, the factory workers, and the crews, all separated by oceans and experience, had combined to prove the original design thesis: the most lethal weapon is the one that is always there. The irony was complete. The tank dismissed for its thin armor was actually the crucial instrument in breaking the mighty Afrika Korps' morale and maneuverability. Mid-1943, Sicily and Italian mainland. Sound, the roar of heavier engines, but the familiar whine of the Stuart. The final act of the Stuarts' European story takes place not in the desert, but in the mountainous, challenging terrain of the Italian campaign. This is the moment of legacy, and the ultimate proof of the tank's versatile design. By 1943, the M4 Sherman had become the definitive Allied medium tank, taking the main role in tank-to-tank combat. The Stuart, far from being retired, found its new critical role: armored reconnaissance and command vehicle. Its speed, low ground pressure, and superb command facilities made it ideal for scouting the narrow mountain roads and densely packed towns of Italy. The crews, now veterans, had developed an almost legendary skill in operating the Honey. They knew its limitations, but they also knew its singular, life-saving advantage: its speed. In a landmine-riddled environment, the ability to quickly traverse difficult terrain or reverse out of an ambush was priceless. The vehicle that the Germans initially thought couldn't stop a rifle round now became the spearhead of the invasion of Europe. Historical note: General George S. Patton, U.S. Army. The Stuart is the perfect reconnaissance tank. Fast, reliable, and gives the crews the vision they need. You cannot win a fight without knowing where the hell you are, and the Stuart tells us. The technological evolution continued, with many Stuarts having their main turret removed and converted into the T8 light armored car or command variants, demonstrating the flexibility of the chassis. The Stuart's legacy is one of the most successful Lend-Lease vehicles, used extensively not just by the British, but also by the French, Soviet Union, and Chinese forces, proving its worth in climates and terrains far beyond the sandy North African origins. The climax of the Stuart's service narrative is its quiet, persistent presence in the breakthrough battles, not its starring role. It was the Stuart crews that scouted the way to the Gothic Line, and it was a Stuart that first reported the collapse of Italian resistance in Naples. It was the unsung hero, the reliable workhorse that allowed the more glamorous, heavier tanks to execute the main attack. The final irony, which summarizes the entire story, is that the thin 9mm armor that was the subject of such derision became irrelevant. The Stuart was not about protection. It was about operational velocity, the speed of movement, the speed of repair, the speed of information. The tank was never the best. It was simply the most efficient instrument of industrial power applied to warfare. The Axis' singular focus on penetration power and armor thickness blinded them to the strategic reality that in a war of attrition, reliability, and overwhelming numbers always win over individual machine superiority. The Stuart was the physical embodiment of the American production line that ultimately choked the Axis war machine. The soldiers who drove the Honey, the engineers who designed its simple strength, and the factory workers who welded its thin plates together achieved a victory not of steel but of scale and stamina. The M3 Stuart, the humble tin can tank, forever changed the definition of a successful war machine. It proved that sometimes the secret to victory is not the hardest shell but the fastest escape route, and the engine that never quits. The 9mm secret was never the weakness of its armor, but the power of the logistics it represented. Thank you for exploring this incredible chapter of the Second World War with us. If the untold stories of technology and the resilience of the human spirit intrigue you, make sure to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel for more deep-dive historical documentaries.